So good morning and welcome to the panel on moving the needle for large-scale implementation of renewable energy. My name is Bruce Usher. I'm co-director of the Social Enterprise Program here at Columbia Business School and teach several courses related to renewable energy. Before I introduce the panelists, I was thinking a little bit about the topic yesterday evening, and as usual when I think about renewable energy, I get a little schizophrenic because one can easily be very optimistic about what's happening in this space. We've seen investment in the sector go from about $50 billion about half a dozen years ago to last year $260 billion worldwide. And that's a big number. There's a really extraordinary amount of investment capital going into this space. At the same time, if you look at how much electricity is generated by renewables, 6 years ago it was about 3.5% of global energy production, which is a pretty small number. And after all that investment, we're still only at 6%. So 94% of our energy, our electrical generation, is still from fossil fuels. So I think that the topic's really pertinent. How do we move that needle well beyond 6%? How do we get there? Our three panelists today, we're going to do three things in the session. The first is I've asked them each to just speak for a few minutes, a few slides if they wish, just to introduce themselves, their topic, their company, their business, a little bit of background. So just a couple minutes each. Then we'll have a few questions, which I'll pose to the three panelists, and then we'll have time to open it up questions from all of you. So just start with Izzet down on my right, and over to you. Now, whatever you prefer.
Okay. I don't mind getting up.
It's yours.
Sitting too much. First of all, good morning. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Rebbe, for having me over, for bringing it up and inviting me to this panel especially, and to the rest of the Energy Symposium organizers. Second of all, what I'd like to thank is this morning actually is special for me, because about 4.5 years ago, I started my company, Carbone. And it largely hinged on the knowledge I gained in Bruce's class. Before that, I was in the IT space. And whatever he said, I believed. And I started a company. And here we are. So a special thanks to you.
There's a lot of pressure on the success of your business.
Yeah, so you can count on him. And definitely no pressure there for future students on my side. I'm an internal optimist. I cannot fight it. In fact, when you were saying about the percentage of renewables still not meeting the larger numbers, I'm originally from Turkey, and the fact that is the global energy consumption has gone up by a lot. If you look at China, Turkey is having its electricity demand. Can you hear me well, by the way? Electricity demand rise by 9%. There's not enough projects you can do. For instance, we're looking at a 200 megawatt project. So I see it as, I think renewable energy has grown a lot, but so did the demand, except in the US. So what is Carbone? I won't spend too much time. Carbone is a company founded in Columbia University when I was doing the MBA program. It's a renewable energy and environmental markets firm. It was founded officially in 2008 at the end, literally after I graduated. Located in New York, London, and Istanbul, working with major companies. But what we do is, pretty much the easiest way I find explaining that is integrated, brokerage, capital advisory, and research services, described as here. What we do today, and I figured I'll just use this slide to explain you what we do. We have, on the brokerage side, our firm brokers long-term forward contract for renewable energy credits, solar renewable energy credits, carbon credits, as well as fuels like biopellets that goes into burning biomass power plants in Europe and in the US, generally environmental credits across the US, as well as electricity that basically people generate, and we do it in very, very large quantities, working with over 5,000 people, over 200 clients. Our capital advisory has grown out of what we do because we knew all the developers, investors, and the utilities we originate projects. We originate solar projects, wind projects, biomass power plants, energy efficiency power plant, let's say projects, and then we capitalize them with equity, tax equity, and debt. And we do this either as a financial advisor, or sometimes even take assets under management when capital doesn't want to be involved. And lastly, one of my proud divisions is the research division. We launched the research division at the end of the first year. We figured we're always in the market. There's not enough data on a micro level in terms of there's a lot of coverage and understanding what's going on in the US about renewable energy, but not enough about what's going on at the New Jersey state level, what is trading at what price, what kind of investments is coming, and what are the regulations, and we grew it to 30 different coverage areas. Today we publish over Bloomberg, SNL, Argosy Daily. We have monthly tear sheets on different regions, and we get hired by very large companies to advise them on which investment they should do in terms of research. For instance, in Ohio, should they build more renewable energy? Or in Idaho, should they put in more wind farms? Or where can they look for a biomass? So in a snapshot, that's our company. We have been doubling our growth every year. Also, one important point here is I think over 50% of the people who work at our place is from Columbia University's different groups. And we continuously always look for new interns, new people to join our team. We continuously grow. And with that, these are the examples of some clients we work with. These are the awards we won. And that's it. For any questions, I'll be around later on that. And thank you again.
Thanks, Izzet. Clint, over to you.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, everybody. Ravi, Dan, thanks so much for having me today. My name's Clint Plummer. I'm Vice President of Development with Deepwater Wind. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about who we are, a little bit of background on myself. I'm not a Columbia alumnus. I actually did my master's at MIT. Fortunately, I don't think we have much of a sports rivalry, so we can let that one go. But I started a little development company after graduate school at MIT, started building small-scale power plants. We built 3 cogeneration plants here in New York City. We built some landfill gas power plants outside of Chicago, and dabbled in a number of other sort of energy efficiency projects. After that, I went on and joined the fledgling team that soon got capitalized and became Deepwater Wind. Our focus is on building large-scale offshore wind within 15 to 20 miles of major urban centers in the Northeast. So the basic concept is this. By building these large, several hundred megawatt power plants offshore, we're able to deliver power where it's needed most. Large urban centers like New York, Long Island, Boston are at the very ends of the transmission systems. They're constrained urban areas, which makes it very difficult to build new power plants or bring new transmission lines in. So the best alternative is to build renewable energy offshore, where we can put it 15 to 20 miles away. So it's over the horizon, it's barely visible, it's in the area of the ocean that has the potential for minimal environmental impacts because birds don't fly out there and you're far enough offshore to be away from sensitive environments. But it's still cheaper. Even though you have to spend more to build the individual wind farm, you avoid several hundreds or thousands of miles of transmission line to deliver that power into the major load centers. So where do we start? Europe has been building these offshore wind farms for over a decade. They have several thousand megawatts across literally dozens of projects up and spinning right now. The US has been trying to get something done on a large scale for about a decade as well, but because of complex federal and state policies, we haven't quite been able to get there. So Deepwater started with a different premise. We said we ought to start small. So we're building what will be the first offshore wind project that's only 30 megawatts. It's a 5-turbine project, but we're using the largest and most advanced turbine out there. It's built by Siemens. It's a 6-megawatt machine, so with 5 machines we can install 30 megawatts of capacity. We're also solving some of those same problems that I talked about, just at a smaller scale. So what you see here is a map of our Block Island wind farm. Block Island's an island that's about 13 miles off the coast of Rhode Island, about 16 miles east of the end of Montauk. So we're putting 5 turbines off the southeastern corner of Block Island. Now, Block Island has some of the same problems on a smaller scale as do those large urban centers. It's an island. It has no electrical connection to the mainland, and all of its power is generated using these dirty 1960s vintage diesel generators. In fact, every day they have to load diesel onto a truck, then drive that truck onto a ferry, and then use diesel to bring that ferry over to the island. So it's incredibly inefficient, expensive, and dirty. We're doing something different. We're installing a new transmission line that runs all the way from Block Island to the mainland. Block Island's got a load at peak of about 5 megawatts, so our 30 megawatt wind farm will produce a lot more energy than the island needs most of the time. So during those periods, power will flow in, will supply all of the island's needs, and the excess will be exported back to the mainland. During the times when the wind farm's down, though, the island can use that cable to bring power in. And so we've created a novel combination of wind and transmission that allows us to achieve the goals of reducing emissions, reducing cost, and creating jobs. We're also doing this at a larger scale with a project that we proposed to the Long Island Power Authority, which we call our Deepwater Wind Energy Center, or DWAC, which is a terrible acronym. But so the concept is the same, just scaled up. What we've proposed is a 900 megawatt wind farm with a 600 megawatt controllable transmission line that runs all the way from southeastern Massachusetts to central Long Island. Now, the way this will work is fundamentally similar to the way that our Block Island project will work. Most of the time, that 900 megawatt wind farm will be producing more than the capacity of the transmission line. So all the power will flow to Long Island, and anything in excess of 600 megawatts will flow back into New England. And in so doing, we're displacing emissions and cost both in Long Island and in New England. During the periods in time, however, when the wind farm is producing less than that 600 megawatts of capacity on the transmission line, LIPA will be able to use that transmission line to bring in power from SEMA, from southeastern Massachusetts, which is one of the more efficient power generating regions in the country. It's got a lot of excess capacity. So we've been able to achieve the same things at a small scale and at a larger scale. Look forward to talking more with you about what we're doing. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think I'll just sit here, but it's great to be here. I do a certain amount of speaking about energy issues, and there's no audiences that are more exciting to interact with than the ones in university settings. And that's partly because the policy world, in which I work a lot, I'm a senior vice president at NRG Energy, and I'm responsible for policy and strategy and sustainability. And in the policy world, discourse has become less, shall we say, rational and productive over the last several years. But in the university world, it's not only very rational and productive, it's often very much focused on entrepreneurial ideas, people, institutions, you know, and just this place, you know, with my co-panelists and those of you I know in the audience, I know this is a hotbed of entrepreneurialism. And in our view, entrepreneurial innovation and leadership is really one of the fundamental key pieces of solving not just the energy problem, but more broadly the climate problem and most of the social problems that we face. It's really not a policy issue as much as it is a business model, entrepreneurial spirit, innovation, and technological solution issue. Policy plays a role, but whether policy should play a bigger role or not, I think we kind of have to make do with what I just talked about. So it's great to be here with you. NRG Energy is it's an interesting place. We're a power company, but we're not a utility. So we have about 25,000 megawatts of generating capacity. I think the entire state of New York's electrical load is around that number. Our generating facilities are some in New York, some in New York City, some in other parts of the Northeast, Louisiana, Texas, and California. And of that 25,000 or so megawatts, 24,000 are traditional utility type power plants, coal plants, oil plants, gas plants, and a nuclear plant or major ownership share in a nuclear facility. The other 1,000 or so are wind and solar. We have, and I think I think right now we're the largest aggregator of solar projects in the entire U.S. power sector. We have under construction and in some of these already under early operation or partial operation, what will be the world's largest concentrating solar power installation when it goes online sometime next year. The Ivanpah Energy Center in Eastern California, the largest PV farm in the world when it goes online later this year in or next year in Arizona, and what would be the largest, if that one weren't to go online, which will go online shortly after in California. And of course, these will all be over, these solar ones, these PV ones will be overtaken by other projects that are even larger than them. But right now, NRG is I believe, has the largest portfolio of solar projects that are under construction in the U.S. power sector. We've also announced a merger with another independent power producer company called GenOn, which when that's completed, which we think will be in the not too distant future, will make us, I think, the third largest power company in the United States in traditional power. So we've got, the way we think about this is we have a very large base of traditional power plants, which we're fully aware of both their economic importance and their contribution to the grid and the challenges they pose in terms of climate change and sustainability. And on that platform, we're building what we think is the largest platform of clean energy solutions. And I'll run through just what those are as an overview. So in addition to this very large-scale solar platform, we have a pipeline of additional large-scale solar projects that we're trying to bring to fruition through the development process. We have about 400 megawatts of wind power. We are developing what will be the largest carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and sequestration facility at an existing power plant at one of our Texas coal plants. When and if we can bring that across the finish line. And by the way, we're very excited about the potential for carbon capture in conjunction with enhanced oil recovery as a way to actually make it economic without a price on carbon. Even though we worked for several years, multiple years, to help try to get Congress to enact a price on carbon, without it we still think there's a way for CCS to be viable. We're doing a lot of distributed resource development as well, including distributed solar generation focusing on schools, universities, and stadiums. In fact, the Meadowlands Stadium, the Philadelphia Eagles Stadium, the Washington Redskins stadiums all have our solar panels in their parking lots and on them, and some of them have other energy efficiency and energy saving facilities there. These are good projects for us, but they're great projects in terms of making the viability of clean energy much more visible to other businesses and to retail consumers, which we think is very important. Because of the other things we're also doing, we're building several electric vehicle charging networks. Basically, if people own electric vehicles, they're very concerned about their battery running down when they're coming home from work or something, or driving across town. And our view is that the best sort of solution to getting people over this range anxiety is for there to be commercially developed, judiciously placed networks of high voltage fast charging equipment scattered around the sort of commuting shed or the driving zone of a metropolitan area, so that people can buy a membership that gives them cheap access to this network, and they'll feel completely comfortable going out in their electric vehicle because they know if their battery happens to run down because, say, it's extra hot or extra cold and they run their air conditioner or heater more than they thought, or their kid forgot to plug the car in when they got home from their date last night, or those kinds of things that happen. They'll know, well, that's no problem. I can pop into this place and in 15 minutes I can get enough juice in my battery to get me back home. So we're installing these networks in Houston, Dallas, trying to develop a much larger network in California, and looking at some other key markets for those. And finally, we're looking at going beyond the distributed solar at the commercial level and the institutional level to the residential level. And all of this, we think, hooks up with our retail energy supply businesses, which in states like New York, like Pennsylvania, like New Jersey, like Texas, like many other states, where individual households and businesses can shop for an electricity provider, much like you can shop for a cell phone provider. We have businesses that sell that electricity, including one, Green Mountain Energy, that sells only green energy that's provided by matching up renewable energy credits with grid power megawatts and converting it into essentially the customer is choosing to buy their power from the renewable energy facilities that are creating these renewable energy credits when they inject clean power into the grid. The Empire State Building is one of our customers, so when you see the Empire State Building lit up at night, that every one of those photons is coming from or represents a renewable energy megawatt hour that's actually been generated and injected into the grid. And we look at bringing all of these services together, the distributed solar, the electric vehicle charging systems, energy management services, which we're also developing at the business and household level for energy efficiency and demand response, bringing all of these together through our retail marketing arms to actually provide consumers with the clean energy sustainable solutions that we think they want, and that as the technologies get better and better, become actually more and more attractive relative to the power that we make in our power plants and sell through the grid. So we're trying to, you know, build the businesses of tomorrow on the foundations of the businesses of today in the power sector. And I'm really happy to be here and be part of this conversation with you all.
Thank you for the introduction, self-introductions from each one of our panelists this morning. That was a good start. When people look at renewable energy growth, and particularly at sort of creating a step change, moving the needle in the sector, the conversation often turns to what people refer to as gaps or hurdles that the sector needs to overcome to get there. And people refer to financing gaps or technology that needs to be developed, new technologies or policy that needs to be implemented to make this happen. If each of the panelists, if you could speak to the one gap you think is the biggest gap, and whether you think we will overcome it, and some idea of when. If we could start with that. How about that as an opening question? And Steve, you grabbed the microphone, so why don't you respond first, and we'll go down from there.
Okay, so I used to think that the biggest gap was we needed a price on carbon. Then I used to think that the biggest gap was that we needed to get the cost of renewable or clean energy resources, in which I would include things like carbon capture and sequestration and nuclear, down to a point where they were really just competitive with everything else, so people would just naturally choose them. And I still think those are important, but I think the single biggest gap right now is not those things. I think, let me just give a real quick sketch of an example of why I think what I'm about to say is the biggest gap. When we started building this electric vehicle charging network, we realized that, well, the product doesn't exist. Nobody owns electric vehicles. The problems that you're trying to solve for consumers, the range anxiety thing, that doesn't exist because consumers don't own electric vehicles. The value you're going to add to an electric vehicle dealership about, you know, the first thing the customer asks is, well, where do I charge this thing? And, you know, how do I get something installed in my garage, which we do too as part of this thing. That problem, the customer problem, doesn't exist. The service agreements, like the agreements to put these things at Walgreens and, you know, I forget the name of the big Houston supermarket chain, but, you know, the places where we're going to put all these things where they're convenient, the relationships to do that don't exist. And this actually turns out to be a classic problem for innovative technologies. It's not just getting the thing, you know, off the lab bench. It's creating the supply chain and the value network. You know, channels to market, customer service, demand, awareness, delivery, scale economies. All these things involve working not only inside your own company, but with other companies to make all this new stuff. And to do it in a way that won't fail, as my entrepreneurial colleagues know all too well, it's easy to fail, but it's hard to succeed. So doing it in ways that will succeed. So I would say the biggest gap in making a clean energy future happen is actually the entrepreneurial creation of effective businesses and effective business models and effective networks of, you know, like economic transactional networks that allow this stuff to succeed. And that's a bigger challenge than having the costs and the policies right. Because history is littered with technologies that were actually cheaper than something else or better than something else at the same cost that failed. And so I think that's the biggest gap, and that's why I think it's particularly exciting to talk about this stuff at a place like Columbia, where a lot of people are studying how to be an entrepreneur and how to solve those kinds of problems.
It's interesting because that's not the gap that most people refer to initially. In academia, with this dry term of capacity building, it's a term I really don't like, but is really perhaps the largest gap. Interesting. Clint, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, I grew up on a farm in western Ohio, and one of the things you learn growing up on a farm is how difficult it is and how many things have to go right to produce a crop. And I think about growing something like renewable energy in a lot of the same terms. So I'm supposed to be using this time to talk about what the one policy issue is, and I'd say it's balance among policy issues and clear political will. We need a lot of things to go right to make renewable energy be big in this country. We need the right commercial models, because over the last 3 years we've seen a dramatic collapse in the price of natural gas, which ripples across the entire power sector, and that just changes the business model in a lot of ways for renewables. We need clarity on our tax and incentive programs. Europe has had very clear, very stable, albeit maybe not the best, incentives for renewables, but even in the absence of perfect incentives, because they've had stability, they've been able to build out a lot of capacity, particularly in offshore wind. We need to get the right supply chain here in the U.S., but you can only get the supply chain, you can only get the people to invest in building the new manufacturing capacity that'll bring down prices once you have the right commercial models, the right incentive structures out there. So I think it's a balance among a number of things, and all that comes back to having the clear political will to act.
I think when you ask the question of one wish that we would have, yeah, just so you know, in the future, even the genie in a bottle gives you 3 wishes. So I'm going to try to have one. But I think the one thing that differentiates renewable energy from conventional energy is storage. That's the one they basically, for instance, in Texas, you have all these wind farms that have to sell at a loss. However, if they had storage capacity, they could send power not only to their next door neighbor, but also through larger grids. So in fact, storage is the one technological solution I think that's going to have very, very big ramifications for the development of renewable energy. That's the one I think then you'll see someone say, well, I'm going to build a giant solar farm all over across the desert and then store it and, you know, ship it whenever necessary. Combined with that, I think if there's a knowledge gap in the US, people still think conventional energy is what fax was to businesses, where you used it every day, and renewable energy is email to everybody, which is, it was used back then like only by computer wizards. What I'm trying to say is, when I was just in Europe, by the way, for 5 days. When I talk about renewable energy, still people think of it not as an infrastructure project, but as a gimmick that's used to generate energy, or as a new technology thing, like almost like toy. In their mind, people cannot combine the fact that they all serve the same purpose of delivering electricity. So the knowledge gap is one I think that should be resolved. And I'd say that the price of power that's measured as the base price of power when you study electricity today is always said as coal. Coal generation is the cheapest, and you take that as base price power. I'm pretty confident that in a decade from now, at most, people are going to put that new chart that goes in steps by saying price of renewables and add on everything else in the long run. So we'll see.
That's terrific. Unless you've been living in a cave in the past 12 months, you may have noticed there's a presidential election going on. Curious as to what our panelists think about how that might affect this sector going forward, whatever the outcome is of the election? What the election means to this sector? No one wants to address that one. Any thoughts generally?
Yeah. Well, I have to admit, sometimes it's a little hard to tell where one of the candidates is really coming from, because the story seems to change as time goes by. But I think if you put it all together, I think it's fair to say that President Obama is if reelected, is going to remain focused on energy solutions and on advancing clean energy technologies, aggressively, probably building on lessons learned, good and bad, from the massive efforts that happened in the first term, and that President Romney is going to be less focused on that, and probably more focused on helping the country sell more of its fossil resources into a high global oil market. And I think that the right solution there is it's kind of a Goldilocks solution. One of the amazing things about renewable energy is, as Izzet just mentioned, is that it's getting cheaper really fast. I mean, solar panels, PV panels in 1976, when President Carter wisely chose thermal panels to put on the White House roof because they were a lot cheaper than PVs. PVs cost, in 2010 dollars, cost about $76 a watt. Now they're closer to 76 cents a watt. And there's just nothing else in the entire energy space whose costs have come down that precipitously. It's like a Moore's Law kind of thing. Every time the amount of solar deployed goes up by a factor of 10, the cost has gone down by a factor of 2. Scale economies, innovation, competition, building a better mousetrap, finding out cheaper ways to process silicon into more efficient cells, all that kind of stuff. The balance of system costs, all those things just keep going down. But they're not down low enough yet to where it actually just is more attractive to build a solar plant as part of a power system than to build a gas plant as part of a power system, partly because gas costs are also very low, and the gas plant, you can turn it on 24 hours a day if you want to. So those cost reductions need to keep going. Storage, better approaches to system integration, better ways to balance out renewable energy, all those need to evolve fairly quickly, and that means a glide path in a reduction of subsidies or incentives tuned to the different kinds of technologies would be very appropriate. A complete stopping of them would slow down that kind of innovation and scale deployment that is driving these cost reductions. So it seems a policy environment that recognizes that renewable energy is getting closer and closer to the point where it can actually contribute economically without policy drivers is emerging, but that to get there we need to continue large-scale deployment and innovative ways of reducing costs and incorporating it into the power system and into people's lives would be the right path. And I think, I'm not sure that President Romney would see it that way.
Clint, does the election impact your ability to develop offshore wind?
It impacts it incredibly. I agree with a lot that's been said. Federal policies are incredibly important. I think one of the things that hasn't been talked about a lot is the importance of economic growth. And one of the challenges that the entire power sector faces is that loads, the demand for electric power, have gone down fairly considerably since 2008. They're starting to come back up. But one of the surest ways to develop new renewable energy projects is to make sure that there's a demand for our product, that there's a demand for electricity, because there are a lot of old coal plants out there that are going to need to be retired simply because they're reaching the end of their economic and engineering life. So if we can focus on growing the economy when we get to those end-of-life issues, we'll have the ability to replace those old plants with new renewables. Now, in addition to growth, we also need a comprehensive federal energy policy, which we haven't had in quite some time. That's got to cover a number of things. One, we've got to address what is our policy with regards to domestic production of oil and natural gas. That's important because the price of natural gas determines the price of electric power, and that then determines how much we actually make, how much we receive, and how much we need in order to build a large-scale renewable energy project. So we need a clear federal policy about how much oil and gas are we going to produce domestically and what are we going to do with it. We also need clarity around leasing on federal lands. The entire outer continental shelf where we're building our wind farms are federal lands, and we have to go through a federal leasing process to do that. That's very complex, and it takes the better part of a decade to get done under today's policies. And finally, we need more clarity around permitting. And in what I think is one of the most egregious examples of regulation gone wrong, it's faster and easier by about a factor of 3 to permit a new oil and gas platform offshore than it is to permit an offshore wind farm, which is to say I can go out and get a lease to drill oil offshore faster, easier, and cheaper than I can get a permit to install an offshore wind farm. If we have a policy that says we want more renewables, that's ludicrous. We need to change it.
You need a lobbyist. So what I would say is I'm going to rephrase the question because I think it's a very, very big question. What happens, and maybe nothing happens because it seems like politics doesn't move anything these days in Congress. But I want to rephrase it as what happens to production tax credits, what happens to investment tax credits, and what happens to renewable portfolio standards at the state levels. I personally think that obviously it's really hard to guesstimate what's going to happen to all of them, but they counterbalance each other. Production tax credits and investment tax credits reduce the amount of investment necessary on a renewable portfolio standard level. If you're not familiar, I'll make it very easy. Try to make it easy. Let's say I'm going to take a random state like New Jersey, and I'm not sure what their 2020 goals is, but I think it's something like 20% of energy should come from renewables by 2020. And the way they make it happen is a combination of power prices plus renewable energy credits. So what happens is today the government gives you a 30% investment tax credit. So when you invest $100, technically speaking, you get to deduct depreciation by a lot and get some investment credits. And production tax credits for especially wind, where you get an additional 22 cents per megawatt hour, I may be a little bit off, per kilowatt hour to make up for the excess revenue you need. So in a way, what I want to say, when elections happen, in the short run, you're going to see either production tax credit be extended, and therefore the government is going to do something about it and allow extensions, so you're going to be happy, and I will too. And investment tax credit after 2016 will be extended or not. If you didn't have those two, let's say a Republican comes to the government and he hates renewable energy. We don't know these things. During elections, everybody says everything, like 47%. Anyway, on renewable portfolio standards, I think what's going to happen is you're going to see renewable energy credit prices go really high up, and the lack of PTC and ITC being extended. So there is a counterbalance. So I think it will make things harder in the absence of federally granted direction, yet it won't stop, I think, the growth, because renewable portfolio standards require you to build renewable energy. So something's got to give at the end.
That's actually a very, very interesting way of looking at it. I'm going to ask one last question to the panelists and then open it up to you for questions. But the question I'm going to ask is actually a two-part question. And the first part is, which technology is most exciting to you right now in renewables? Clint, I think I know your answer to that one. But just pick one of the many technologies out there, which is most exciting to you. And a follow-up question, which if you could address at the same time, is from a career perspective for whether MBA students graduating or anyone who's interested in a career in this sector, what advice would you give? Which may not be the same thing as it's most exciting, but don't get a job there. What general career advice do you have for people interested in the sector? Steve, would you like to start us off again?
Well, I think by explaining how big a position we have in solar compared to everything else in the clean energy space, I think I've kind of voted with my corporate feet, so to speak, on that one. Solar to us is an extremely compelling renewable energy for, I think, three big reasons. One is the technology does seem to have gone through and to have every potential to continue to go through these really massive increases in manufacturing cost reductions and efficiency increases that have already put it in today's iteration sort of within the point where, you know, it's probably cheaper with the 30% investment tax credit to build a solar plant for peaking needs in an area where the sun shines every afternoon than it is to build a gas plant for peaking needs. There's some controllability issues around that make it not quite an apples to apples comparison. We think that's going to continue. So that's, you know, that cost reduction, and the minimum scale at which you can achieve these efficiencies is getting smaller too. So, you know, rooftop solar today is more expensive than ground mount. New technologies, new materials, things that incorporate solar cells in building materials could totally change that equation. So that's reason one. Reason number two is even simpler. People use more electricity in the daytime, and that's when the sun shines. One of the things we've learned about terrestrial wind is that it blows mostly at night in the U.S. when people use the least amount of electricity. So there's just less room for it in the system, and the prices are lower. So solar has a sort of natural economic advantage. And I think the third reason, which is not really a motivation for business decision making perhaps, but if you just think about the scale and scope of the global energy system and the global challenge of getting to energy system that does not create catastrophic climate change, there's a lot of research that suggests there's only two resources that can actually achieve that scale. One is solar and one is nuclear. And that doesn't mean other niche things are not worth pursuing, geothermal, wind, biomass, wherever they make sense. But it does seem to suggest that there's a very strong future for solar and a real need for making solar cheaper and more integrated, including storable, than it is now. So that's those are the reasons I think solar. The first two for us as a company, and the third, at least for me as a person who tries to think about the long term and our social impact, all suggest it's a big part of the solution. In terms of career advice, you know, I think these fields are incredibly exciting. I think they need there's needs all across the board. A lot of people look at the policy stuff, and I'm a registered lobbyist. I spend a lot of time in Washington working on energy policy issues. That's an important thing, and it's an honorable occupation. But I think, you know, so if anybody wants to do that, you know, come on in. The water's interesting. I think the real need is, you know, there's lots of needs. So basic research and development, new technologies, you know, spray paintable solar cells with efficiencies at 30%. That would be fantastic. You know, there's research about technologies that could do that. Cheap inverters, cheaper ways of integrating and mounting solar in different kinds of environments. I mean, there's just tons of room for that at the research level. I think there's even more room in terms of what I was saying before about business innovation. You know, read books like The Innovator's Dilemma, The Innovator's Solution. Try to figure out what it is how can we keep the beta. You guys are all too young to remember this, but there used to be these things called VHS players. You know, you'd put a tape in instead of a CD and you'd watch a movie on it. And there was a dorky one and there's a really great one. And the dorky one became the dominant market model. You know, we can't, and it was called VHS and the other one was called beta. We can't, that kind of happened with steam cars versus gas cars back in the 1910s. We really can't afford to have that kind of thing happen again. We need to find out ways to make the most, you know, sort of the best technologies from a social perspective, also the best technologies from a pure economic and consumer adoption perspective. And that's a business model and a business and marketing, a business ecosystem design challenge, not a policy challenge. So I think that that's a really exciting area for people to look into.
It's terrific.
Well, I don't mean to contradict you, but I would say that offshore wind is not my only favorite technology. So, look, I think offshore wind is a great technology. It's got a lot of promise in certain areas. So does solar. So do other new technologies. And I think we oftentimes try to find the magic energy machine, the silver bullet that will solve all of our problems. And the fact of the matter is it just doesn't exist. And we need to embrace a philosophy that says that there are the right tools for the right problems. Now, offshore wind is a great tool for solving a problem of bringing renewable energy in a large scale to the Northeast, where we've got great winds. The wind offshore actually peaks in the middle of the day when people are using the most electricity rather than at night, and there are some meteorological reasons for that. But it's not a be-all, end-all. It's not going to work in every place in the country. The West Coast, for example, has waters that are much, much too deep for offshore wind using conventional technology. So we need another generation before we see that sort of technology. Solar makes a lot of sense in areas where we've got sunshine during the middle of the day every day. But it's really hard to justify solar in areas where you don't have the same sort of sunshine. So I think we need a comprehensive all of the above solution. Nuclear makes a lot of sense in certain areas, and there's been some great advances in nuclear technology when it can be done safely and far away from population centers. I think there's some interesting work going on right now in bioengineering and in creating biofuels. So I think there's a lot of interesting things out there, and places like Columbia and MIT and the great research institutions of the world need to continue to move these technologies forward. And I think there's a lot of cause for hope around that. Recently, GE, NRG, and ConocoPhillips announced a joint venture to invest in new energy technologies, and I salute that. I think that's a great thing. In terms of career opportunities, boy, there's a big spectrum out there. And I think there are opportunities in finance. I think there are opportunities in policy. I think there are opportunities in engineering and sciences and project development. So I think one needs to make a decision that we're going to be in renewable energy and that you're going to be part of the solution with it. This is something that can be done, but it's going to take a lot of really great minds at it. So I'd say to the students out there, it's going to take the innovators and the entrepreneurs to get us to a game change in large-scale renewables, and it's going to take a lot of us. So come on in, the water's fine.
Izzet, last word over to you before I take questions.
So personally, I'd like to see teleportation, because it really sucks to commute and everything. That would be really nice.
So somebody can work on that, right?
Yeah, that would be really, really nice. Beam me up, Scotty stuff. But now the question you asked is, do I prefer wave, solar, wind, hydro, biomass, nuclear fusion, or many other technologies that generate electricity? Personally, I think all of them are great. If done properly, they generate electricity, and that's what we need. But I think the one technology which I mentioned before would be storage. If you could imagine store gigawatts of electricity in a glass like this, cup like this, you could take it from New York and ship it to wherever the electricity is needed. You plug it in and you can use it. Then whatever you generate would be properly utilized and properly distributed. Then you could have a desert, as I said, cover it up with solar panels, for instance, and then put it in this bottle and send it up. So I would say storage and battery is the most important innovation that I'd like to see, and I know it's not easy. As far as career perspective, this was 4 and 7 months ago. Before I took Bruce's class, I was sitting in an MBA class, maybe a little more, 4 years. And the CEO of Iron Mountain came to our class, and he said, same question was asked, and he said, the one advice he shared with us was, make sure you eliminate the things you don't like to do and don't lie to yourself. And also, it shouldn't be in saying, I don't like finance just because there's been some recent bad news about it. It shouldn't be the case. The industry is going to grow, for instance. But it should be saying, do you want to be an analyst? Do you want to be a salesperson? Do you want to be a marketing person? Or do you want to build something? Whichever it is, pick it that way and eliminate the stuff you don't like, making sure. Because that leaves you with a narrower window. And on a personal note, I was always excited about building a company. So even the very first thing I did in my life was building an online language learning company. Following on with that was actually being in the IT business and looking and finding a niche in there of building a hacking company with a lot of hackers, because that was needed back then. And then I said, what's the most innovative, forward-looking, and growing sector? And today, you know, renewable energy or technologies that support it as well is one that it has a lot of room to grow. As Bruce started the conversation, he said, you know, I see it's still a very, very small percentage. Well, no matter what happens in the next 30 years, those plants that are running today are going to run out or die or need to be replaced. Well, this is the sector that's going to replace it. So within it, it's just a question of, you know, coming to these conferences and finding what you like. But this is why I personally said I put all my energy and intellect into it. So I'm not a super wealthy person that I can buy into anything. And I felt that, you know, it was a great field to go into. And after that, any questions are welcome on which is for you. So that's what I would say.
I think that's really good career advice from all three of our panelists. Open to questions. We have a few minutes. Sir, if you could just speak up. Yeah.
So yeah, first of all, thank you. This is very...
Sorry, we have a mic here.
You hear me? Great. This was wonderful. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear your perspectives. So for some of us that are kind of semi-informed about the market, it seems like for renewables there are two really strong headwinds coming up. One is, it's already here, is very cheap natural gas. And the other is the exploration of certain kinds of tax credits for wind. So as you look into the future, are you pessimistic, optimistic about some of these prospects? And how are you planning to move forward in a business that has some challenges coming up?
Great question. I can take a first stab at that. I'd say we're relatively optimistic about this space, although there are real challenges out there. And in the absence of real political will to make renewables work at a large scale, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to force renewables to be smaller. It's going to force projects into more limited markets. So in terms of addressing the issues around cheap natural gas, technology has come a long way. It hasn't come far enough to be able to allow renewables to compete head-to-head, but we have come a remarkably long way just in the 5 years that I've been working on building offshore wind. I think technology makes up a lot of that gap, but there are certain markets, places like the Northeast, places on the West Coast, where you don't have the benefits of that natural gas filtering through as much. Yes, power prices have come down here in the Northeast quite a lot, not as much as they have in other parts of the country. With regards to the tax credits, I think we feel relatively optimistic that there will be some progress made on those because it's such a popular issue. Both Republicans and Democrats like the idea of the PTC because in Iowa, for example, about 20% of the state's energy now comes from wind. So it's a huge creator of jobs, it's a huge industry in some very red states, and I think we've got the bipartisan will to get something done. We sure hope so, at least.
I'd like to add two things to it. One is I'm less worried as a generator of electricity sector, let's just say. I would be more worried about for oil. Because natural gas right now is a bigger threat to oil than it is to renewable energy as a transportation fuel. There are, you know, Ed Morse, I think some of you know as one of our advisors and a dear friend to me. And when I asked him, he said the first thing that's going to happen is the 5 trucking routes are actually, there's trucking routes between east to west that carry most of the goods. They're turning into transportation. So gas today, the way you look at it, you say, okay, it's used for electricity, but I think today what you're looking at is a commodity that's going to eat into transportation and also as an export product. So therefore, I think gas is not going to be used the way we see it today, but it's going to be drastically different in the next 10 years. The second thing, and I shared this with my panelists before, is the biggest problem tomorrow that we're going to face it in our lifetimes is going to be water. And it's going to be very questionable how much of that water that you need to drink every day you'll be willing to actually sacrifice and pollute to actually drill gas. And I'm not saying let's not drill gas, but what I'm saying is the cost of extracting gas is going to go up again. And therefore renewables have a better chance to survive and actually be a good friend to natural gas in the long term.
So
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I agree with what these guys said. I just want to share a few insights, some of which I hope this doesn't embarrass you all's colleague Danny Mincer, but some of which I owe Danny because he worked for me this last summer and helped me figure this stuff out with some great computer modeling work that he did. So credit where credit is due. But the first thing to think about is that gas prices, not just for the reasons that Izzet laid out, which is sort of the long-run input costs for fracking, are likely to go up. But just because the market right now is out of balance, there's an excess of supply. We had a 1 in 800 year winter last year, you know, very low demand, like astronomically unlikely even in a warming climate to have that little gas demand. And we've had this explosion of production where people have kind of been irrationally exuberant about drilling horizontal holes and fracking them. And, you know, basically all the drilling companies, many of them have been unable to meet their debt payments because the price of gas that they're producing is not enough to cover their costs and to allow them to repay any debt. So it's, you know, there's serious overproduction, underconsumption, sort of disequilibrium in the gas market. And the forward gas market consistently for the last, you know, since 2008 has showed two conflicting tendencies. One is the increased amount of production in the front end of the curve has been dragging the whole thing down as the lower marginal costs as this technology gets better. But the back end is still up compared to the front end because people say there's no equilibrium. You know, people are drilling these holes, are losing money drilling these holes, and they got to drill fewer holes till demand and supply equilibrate, because otherwise, you know, it's just economically irrational. So what that means is basically gas prices are going to go up from where they are today, even in the short term, you know, the next 5-year period. Meanwhile, solar prices and wind prices and you know, even storage, although it's probably not in the money yet, those costs are all going to continue to come down over the same time frame. So, you know, it's kind of Ross Perot, like we got this line going down and this line going up, and, you know, they're going to cross over in the not too distant future. So that suggests that the problems that the gas market is creating for the renewable market are temporary. And at the same time, the problems that the gas market is creating for traditional generating is significant because it doesn't pay to build a new generator, especially not a new coal or nuclear generator. And we got a bunch of coal units that are about to retire and a bunch of nuclear units that are facing relicensing, not all of which will happen. So there's this kind of big sucking sound in the future of the power sector, and gas costs are going up and renewable costs are going down. So, you know, it seems to me there's a real opportunity for renewable if we can continue making it more and more economic and easy to integrate and find ways to lower the cost and increase the usefulness of it through innovation and deployment. Now, the tax credit is actually very much related to that because the production tax credit, you can build a wind farm in a good wind resource, in a good wind regime today without a production tax credit and have it be competitive in its cost with the levelized cost of building a new combined cycle at this future gas curve. So it's, you know, a great wind resource, terrestrial wind resource, can compete with a gas resource on this sort of cost per megawatt hour basis. When you think about it happening at night, needing transmission, most of the good wind resources being sort of crowded and used up, and not having enough transmission outlet, it's not quite that simple. But wind is almost at the point in the best spots with the best new machines where it can actually compete without the PTC. The PTC is really useful when you factor in the real world issues of you got to get transmission, you can't build, there's other wind resources that aren't grade 5 that, you know, that don't have such good economics and stuff. The ITC, you know, you can look at that at projections of solar costs going down and see there's a point where the 30% ITC could go to 10% and not impair the economics of deployment. It doesn't look like that's on January 1st, 2017, you know, when that date, when it is in law. So a smoothing out and a glide path, an extension with a potential glide path downwards on both the PTC and the ITC would solve these problems while allowing the bigger questions that are facing your generation and, my kids' generation more than mine is like when we all retire and you guys have to pay all our Social Security and Medicare stuff, what's going to make you actually want to work, 60 hours a week so that you can take home 10 hours worth a week for yourselves and send the other 50 to us. That's a real problem that's going to force some kind of tax reform, reduce tax expenditures, increase tax revenues, like we heard about the other night, sometime pretty soon. And the investment tax credits and production tax credits are going to get massaged in that same debate. But there's a solution path that I think, because of the gas prices going down and the renewable costs, going up and renewable prices going down, there's a solution space for all these problems. It's not clear that our political system will discover it easily or efficiently, but I think it's there.
Another question? Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question for Mr. Bensusan first. You place high hopes on batteries and storage. Do you know of any good research being done in those fields? Has your company seen any and very promising storage technologies?
Yeah, plenty of different ones, in fact, and there are plenty of different ways also. I'm just going to touch upon at the macro level. I know that there are, first of all, the actual lithium-ion batteries that are being stored and bought back to be put into use again. For those of you that may or may not be familiar, a battery, when it quote-unquote dies in your phone, is still able to store power, not enough to run maybe a phone, but many other things. So that's one, the reusing of big batteries. Second is acid, lead, or some combination chemistry that they're working on. Many on, in fact, storing compressed air, where you compress the air into an environment and you let it go and turbines spin. Another one, which is storing water, which is an age-old thing to do. You put the water on top, let it go down. In most of these cases, the cost of the development of the technology is not too expensive. However, the transformation of energy from one medium to the next loses a lot, which is what you need to look at into storage. So, and I can find out more, maybe.
We have time for one or two really quick questions.
Steve brought up carbon capture and storage, and I think that's a really important technology, but it was brought up in the context of oil recovery. And I think many people in the room would wonder whether that belongs in a clean tech debate, because it's lowering the price of oil. And you're moving long cycle carbon, oil, and turning it into short cycle carbon, CO2, to recover more long cycle carbon from the oil. So I was curious, how close do you think we are to carbon capture and utilization, to the point where it's actually a feedstock, the carbon, to biofuel through algae or through other methods, to the point where it's actually a viable product, not just something you're putting away?
Well, first, let me just address the premise of your question just a little bit. My own view about CCS and EOR is that if you think about the sort of supply elasticity and demand elasticity of oil, producing more from a field that has got, through tertiary recovery, like is being done with CO2, with natural CO2 from, from vents in the earth kind of stuff today, I don't know that increases the total amount of oil being consumed. I think it substitutes, one cheaper inframarginal unit for a marginal unit, but it doesn't necessarily change the overall price enough to induce more consumption globally. It could if it became really, cheap and ubiquitous. But I think it kind of incrementally, EOR does not materially increase the amount of oil being consumed. It just shifts the source of the same amount being consumed because it doesn't change the price in the global market because it's too small a contribution. That could change with massive EOR. What I think is really exciting about EOR from a kind of climate change perspective is CCS technologies that you think about CCS specifically in terms of capturing CO2 from existing coal plants, like the gigawatt of new coal plants that already exist in China, the the 100 gigs or so, I mean the terawatt that exists in China, the 100 gigs that that is likely to be long-term survivors on economic terms, at least in this country. We need a way to take the CO2 out of this giant global fleet of existing newer coal plants, or else we need a way to completely replace them very quickly. And it might be easier and more effective to find a way to take the CO2 out and not use it for enhanced oil recovery necessarily, but to take it out cheaply and efficiently. And we need that pretty quick. And one of the big causes of despair amongst all, those of us who worked on the Waxman-Markey legislation and saw it not succeed was that we don't know what's going to be the next big driver to get the innovation, the scale economies, and the cost reductions in CCS for that cohort of coal plants. What's going to make that happen? And many people I know think it just can't happen without a $90 a ton price on carbon. I personally don't think a $90 per ton price on carbon is going to happen. But I do think that there's enough, at $100 oil, you can make enough money on EOR to actually create really strong incentives for innovation and perfection of this technology and making it quite cost effective, which then makes it easier to deploy for policy reasons that don't maybe need to have a $90 price and that could actually materialize, internationally and domestically fairly quickly. So I think that's the reason to think optimistically about CCS from EOR. The other, utilization of CO2 from coal plants and reconverting it through some sort of, we've worked on several of these things with biofuels and algae and stuff, and so far they've not been very promising. We've actually done pilot programs. We've done a lot of due diligence on those kinds of technologies. Those could exist, but in a way they have kind of the same problem that, you're not sequestering the stuff, you're reusing it, but it's still ending up there. It's essentially increasing the carbon efficiency of fuels, but it's still taking stuff from underground and putting it up in the atmosphere, just getting a lot more vehicle miles traveled out of it in the process. That's not saying it's bad, but I'm not sure it's an ultimate solution either. I think the long-term solution, if we look at power plants that have a 50-year life, is to not need to use carbon-based electricity 50 years from now. And, I think that involves nuclear, solar, renewables, storage, both through batteries and through conversion, sort of like artificial trees or, things that make solar into liquid fuels that don't create anthropogenic carbon emissions.
I think we're out of time. I want to thank our panelists. That was really terrific. Thank you very much.